Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Political Geekfest for February 16. I think it's our second one back for the year. I'm here from Sydney, Peter Lewis from Essential Media, and my partner in crime, Catherine Murphy from Guardian Australia. Had a few technical issues, which is why we're a bit late this morning, but welcome everyone, recognising we're all on Indigenous land wherever we are in Australia, and recognising that land has never been ceded, and paying respects to elders past, present and emerging. So Parliament, and for those that are new, I think you're all familiar, please use the chat, introduce yourself. We'll try to get to a few of you today as well. I've got a little bit of a habit of just getting into a two-way exchange with Catherine, which is great fun for the two of us, but maybe be good for you guys to be in there a little bit as well. But before we get cracking, let's just take a temperature check of Canberra. And I suspect if we're checking the temperature, it's heightened at the moment with a scandal, Catherine. And I'm interested both in what's going on there, but also how that impacts on what looks like the affairs of state, if you will.
Yeah, well, it's both obviously a very serious issue, as anybody on Today who watched the project last night will understand. Some allegations, former Liberal Party staff, a young woman, Brittany Higgins, has made allegations that she was sexually assaulted in the office of ministerial office of Linda Reynolds, who was her employer at the time, in March 2019. It's really a terrible story, and if you didn't watch the project last night, I would encourage you to go and have a look, because it's a pretty extraordinary and very compelling interview. Yes, that has sort of upended the political week a little bit here in terms of the management point that Peter was making. We basically sort of started this week in the government's mind. It was going to be, what did Greg Hunt say yesterday? The eagle has landed. It was going to be vaccination week this week. We've got an AstraZeneca approval, and we also had the arrival of some additional quantities of the Pfizer vaccine, or the putative arrival. So in the government's mind, this week was going to be vaccines and dealing with the barnacle of industrial relations, which also the government is in the process of doing, before Brittany Higgins marched onto the stage yesterday. A story broken first by news.com, and then she did this extensive interview on the project. So Peter's point is the best laid plans sometimes go awry, because obviously we are covering those other issues as well, because they're all important, but there's a lot of focus on the allegations that Brittany Higgins has made, and also around the culture of Parliament House, because we've seen a lot of talk about this, particularly the talk escalating really over the last 12 months, particularly with that Four Corners episode late last year. There's sort of been a focus on whether or not the culture in the building is crook or not, but we seem to have a bubble of conversation which then gets slammed by ordinary political events. So I think some of the women who have endured bad experiences during their time as political staffers and as politicians are finding their voice and wanting their stories to be heard, and more importantly, someone to listen to them and set about making the change that is quite evidently necessary.
Yeah, I in no way did I mean to set this up as a sideshow from the main game, but I think what's interesting is when you watch politics, how, as you say, best laid plans, and then structural weaknesses within the two parties that actually frustrate the hard work of democracy. So I'm wondering on your reflections on, is this a political problem, is it a parliament problem, or is it a conservative political problem or conservative partisan problem that is being exposed at the moment
in terms of the cultural issues?
Yeah,
well, I think it is I think some of the sort of underlying cultural dimensions of this are genuinely multi-partisan. I think all political parties do have trouble with this to different degrees, but I think what we've seen really, particularly over the last 12 or 18 months, is a sort of succession of cases involving women's experiences in Liberal politics, and that's certainly been the sort of the recent cases involving staff. But I think I've just written a comment piece, which I think has probably gone live as we're talking about some of the underlying issues here. It is genuinely complex in terms of the position of staff in politics. Parliament House is a very unusual workplace. Staff serve entirely at the whims of principals. Offices are like little palaces, little courts. They are structured in this highly anachronistic fashion around the interests of the principal. Staff, literally, can be hired and terminated.
Jenna Price had a nice line today, Catherine. The Uber workers of the political system.
Yeah, they are. In many respects, they are. They are the gig economy workers, and that sets up sort of an underlying dynamic of a highly unusual and a very unequal workplace, and that then cascades through attitudes of entitlement. It's genuinely complicated, all of these issues, but the complexities of employment relationships, of the hierarchy of politics, of the culture of politics shouldn't be invoked as necessary preconditions for why things can't change, for why things can't get better. I do think things can get better, considerably better. Also, just one thing quickly, because I know you'll want to get onto the survey, Peter, and you're right, you and I love chatting to one another and we generally rave on too long, so let's try and let someone else get a word in. There's a very interesting book which I encourage you to all add to your order lists, coming out by Kate Ellis, the Labor MP. I think that book's coming out in April. I've read it in manuscript. She basically documents the experiences of female politicians, from Julia Gillard to Julie Bishop, her former colleagues, what they experienced in public life, which is another dimension to what we're talking about. I think it's a very well written book. I think she's got the confidence of the people she's interviewed, and I think it's quite an important book. So I would encourage you all to chase that up and have a read of it once it comes out in April.
Oh, sorry, I just kept myself on mute. Beginner's errors, people. I just said my old colleague and good friend Liz Lucan's on the call, and she just did make the point that just seeing it as a Canberra issue is probably a bit of a cop-out. Do you want to add anything to that, Liz?
Oh, thanks, Pete, and thanks, Catherine, for your reflections on this. But this is an issue I watch with such frustration, being outside Canberra, having worked in footy for 5 or 6 years, and this issue about trying to navigate relationships at work and sexual harassment, and and the argument that the Canberra bubble, or it's a heightened workplace, or just really frustrates me and makes me angry. And the other thing that made me furious last year was this notion that the bonk ban is the answer to sexual harassment, and the treatment of women is really frustrating for me, because it sends this message that somehow there are two people involved in sexual harassment in some ways, or unequal relationships. And I just drives me mad. So I'm sorry I was trying to be in chat just to rave and rant, but this is an issue I could really rave and rant about.
It's good you're raving, Liz, and it's sort of reassuring to me that this culture does exist elsewhere. I'm just conscious of, obviously I work in journalistic culture, which has its own idiosyncrasies, shall we say, but is a very different workplace culture to politics. And the point I made about difference was not the sort of loathed and detested bubble.
Yeah.
It's more that they have particular vulnerabilities in their employment relationship that sort of
true.
Makes this supercharges it. That's all. But if it exists in footy and other places, I'm intrigued by this.
Well, it exists. The issue about the. I think sexual harassment and gendered violence at work is an issue that exists everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the kind of research shows that a more equal workplace does lead to, to kind of, more equal relationships. So safe and respectful relationships start with a whole range of things. But to see kind of politics respond in this way, which is somehow we're going to ban sex, which is just like, anyway.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet now. Just be an interested observer now.
Well, we're going to go into the charts. And we don't have any chart for this particular one. Angela also makes the point that Cecilia Hammond's been put in charge of the PM's review. Catherine, her form was when she was pre-selected for a PERS seat in 2013, said feminism has discouraged young women from aspiring to stay home at young mothers. What the question mark, Catherine?
She is a conservative. She hails, sort of runs with the Conservatives, as it were, Celia Hammond. And I suspect we might hear a little of Celia Hammond's previous statements in question time coming up at 2:00, just an inkling I have. But anyway, look, the reason she has been drafted, well, two people have drafted in terms of the actions today. The PM says he wants Stephanie Foster, who's a DepSec in his department, to come up with some sort of institutional suggestions. And Hammond has been drafted because she's a former, well, this is Morrison's rationale, she's a former university vice-chancellor. She's used to dealing with some of these institutional issues. And I think Celia may have volunteered herself for this undertaking. So anyway, look, we'll have to see what emerges from it. I'm always hopeful that something of substance might emerge from a process, but I think the toughest nut sitting underneath all of this is that power relationship, back to Liz's point about equality in the workplace. There is no equality in a political workplace. There isn't. It's structured basically to avoid equality in the workplace. There is one set of interests in a political office, and that's the bosses. No one else has any valid interests that they are permitted to serve or pursue. Nothing changes in this building until that changes. And the idea that politicians will voluntarily create more equal workplaces in their fiefdoms, that's quite a lot to wrap your mind around. But that fundamentally is what needs to change. So we'll see if our friend Celia Hammond can come up with some decent recommendations. Let's see the substance of what she brings forward.
Right. We're going, not to trivialise that discussion, but let's move into the broader findings from this week's Essential Report. I guess I'd been seeing this week as the week where there might be a bit, not just of the vaccine rollout, but the start of what I think is one of the defining political battles for the next little period, which is who's responsible for keeping our borders safe, and
Definitely.
whether Morrison or the states. So my computer's on the verge of packing it in after 12 months hard work. So John Remington's going to run the slide. So if it's a bit clunky, apologise everyone. Hi, John. And he's going to share the screen rather than me stressing out about that. And he's going to go to full screen there next, aren't you, John? And that's going to be perfect. Beautiful. And we'll go into the first slide, which is about whether people do think it should be a federal or a state responsibility, because from where I'm sitting, and it's very easy to be sitting in Sydney, New South Wales, where I'm not in lockdown, like Liz and many others, who should be responsible for the quarantine system for returning travel? And I guess, as we'll get into some others, should we even be putting a bit of a pause on the returning travellers at the moment? So 6238 say it should be on the federal government. I'm interested, your thoughts, Catherine, on a government which part of their political canon is their toughness on borders, how they're managing to duck and weave away from this one.
Yeah, it's genuinely intriguing. And if you've been on this forum last year, Peter and I kind of kicked this idea around a bit on some of the indicators in the poll last year. It is genuinely fascinating. I think the sort of the two points in the poll that need to be understood together is this slide that we're looking at now, and then what I'm calling the Fortress Australia slide, which is 71% of the sample says shut the damn border. Everyone outside can just stay there, which sort of feeds into the zeitgeist that Daniel Andrews kind of kicked into the public domain late last week. But anyway, putting those 2 points together, from the point of view of the voter, voters think that the Commonwealth is responsible for quarantine because the Commonwealth has spent, the coalition certainly in, being the great hairy chested border managers of the last 10 or 15 years or 20 years, probably more actually. Yeah, 20 years.
Wow.
God, we are that old.
What was that? It was 98, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
No, 2001, sorry.
Yeah,
20-year anniversary.
Yes, it's like, yeah, I'm just astonished, sorry, to wake up in my own life and find that 20 years have passed. Anyway, so the coalition have framed themselves as the big hairy-chested border managers. There has been this weird dynamic, slightly amusing if you're into irony, all last year when Morrison was more aggressive about the state governments and their border closures. Morrison and others, his lieutenants, were kind of wiggling their fingers, censoriously at the premiers for shutting your borders. Oh, you wicked premiers shutting your borders, when Labor premiers kind of turned the border politics back on Morrison. But at the same time, Morrison also kept a border cap, the international border cap. But that was very much played down in the sort of daily political cycle, because Morrison didn't want to be in the situation where people were blaming him for people failing to return home and what might happen out of hotel quarantine. So it is genuinely interesting, these dynamics that
are there blurred lines of power, or is it clear who's controls quarantine, Catherine?
No. I think it is clear that Commonwealth has primary responsibility for quarantine and the international borders, but in practice, it's a shared responsibility. It's sort of like, if you think back to the Ruby Princess, right? When the Ruby Princess arrived, obviously the Commonwealth has a wheelhouse, it has a remit, and state public health officials also have a remit in terms of how people disembark and when they do and how they're checked and all that sort of stuff. So there is a degree of collaboration between the jurisdictions, but in terms of who's responsible, ultimately, whose power is it? Well, it is the Commonwealth. And so we've sort of got the quarantine issue, but then it's sort of related to this point, which if everybody here, I'm sure, watches politics closely, so ignore the preface, but over the last couple of weeks, it's been building up, right? That people should be kept in remote quarantine rather than in hotel quarantine in the cities, particularly now that we have more virulent strains in the country, the UK strain, South African strain, take your pick. There's been this steady drumbeat that we should require people to quarantine in remote areas so that we don't have Holiday Inn style clusters getting out into the community. But while not ruling it out entirely, the Prime Minister has kept that very much on the down low. He said, look, one of the reasons we have hotel quarantine in the cities is proximity to medical facilities, etc. This is more manageable, this is more sensible. We put people out in the regions, that creates its own problems. That's been Morrison's lines. But it's interesting, though, to run those lines through the prism of public sentiment, which is very clear. Like, from the point of view of public sentiment, they want Morrison in charge of the border and they want Morrison in charge of hotel quarantine. So
yeah, and politics is complex, but it's also binary. And I think what's interesting is when you turn it into choices. So who should run it? The federal government. And I think this second slide sort of feeds in a little bit to the context of maybe a little bit of a caution, because we know both sides of politics have had strong approval, but when you force people to choose between the leadership of their PM and their state leader, the state leaders who, let's face it, are closer to the ground in service delivery, have the trust of their communities. So
yeah, this is really interesting.
I think there are just a couple of landmines here for the PM if there was a coordinated state push for the government to assert more control, I guess, at the supply side of people coming into the country, because the borders have never actually been closed, have they? It's always been by exception. And if you're a Hollywood actor or a business person or a
necessary person, you can get permitted and get in. It's sort of you're right. There is this sort of, and it's interesting to think about what Daniel Andrews is doing now with these points in the back of your mind as framing exercises, because Andrews has decided to go on the offensive about this stuff on this area, prosecuting this point of potential vulnerability that Peter referenced a second ago. And that's genuinely quite interesting how the story ends. Well, I guess we just have to follow through and wait and see. It's sort of like with this state, it's sort of like COVID, we've really seen the comeback of the states and territories as jurisdictions. We've really seen, because a lot of the dynamic around politics over the last decade or so has been very nationally focused, in part because of what's happened in my profession, in journalism. We no longer have
You don't have state bureaus, you don't have much view of state politics.
No, like obviously the metro newspapers are still covering state parliaments, but we've been in a cycle over the last decade or so where there has been a lot of focus on what's happened nationally and much less about what's happening in the states. COVID has basically reacquainted voters with their state governments and with the practical service delivery of state governments. And while obviously in our poll, Pete, and in all the other survey data that I have seen from other organisations, and including we've got a reference point in the poll this fortnight about people approving of Morrison's participation in the pandemic, his management of the pandemic, that public approval is quite high, but people know where the power rests in the relationship, and they think their premiers have done a competent job. And that's, again, it's just an interesting dynamic in the Federation.
And just whoever's in the chat with the proud moniker Scotty's empathy consultant, the reason we don't have TAS or NT or ACT is the samples just aren't big enough on a national poll of 1,000 for it to make any sense. So, John, do you want to click to the next slide? That's what you were just talking about, federal government response to COVID. Yeah.
It's almost like I'm a, soothsayer or something, like I'm Nostradamus.
And, gone from 67 to 69, but it's been there forever. So again, I don't think we'll even go back and do our normal discussions about this. It's just strong approval for government, and government workers and politicians kind of become they're the custodians of government, so they get a little bit of credit. Some will say for a change. Do you want to go to the next slide though, John, which was the other part of this, which I think is, as Catherine referred to, Fortress Australia. And I think there is an interesting contradiction between those first two. People want things to return to how they were before COVID-19, but they also want to keep their borders closed. I think there is now a sense that we can't get back to where we were until the rest of the world deals with the pandemic. And that's, I think that is becoming a compelling internal narrative. I think it's very challenging to business and economics, and I think there are huge implications if that's the mindset. And I think what's going to be interesting is governments trying to hold back that pressure because they do know that, it's such a fine edge, isn't it? If you can reopen safely, there's huge rewards economically. But if you stuff it up, Melbourne goes back into lockdown or anywhere else goes back into lockdown. And I think there is also an emerging argument that because Australia's done the first wave so well, the immunity in the community is so low that we're going to be particularly vulnerable to new waves. It's really difficult and complex, isn't it?
Oh, it's really, really difficult and complex. Exactly. I think Stephen Kennedy, the Treasury Secretary, who was before the COVID committee, I think that was last week, recently, did make the point, which Scott Morrison doesn't really make forcefully, but Kennedy did, that what we've demonstrated in this country is that the best public health response is the best economic response. What he meant by that is the effective management, suppression of the curve of infections has enabled Australia to open up. in more sustained fashion than many countries overseas. So we've got to bear that in mind. Best public health response, best economic response. The two are connected. They're not actually in conflict with one another, which sometimes, just saying, they're presented as being in conflict with one another, and that conflict is sort of largely manufactured. The thing about this slide that we've got in front of me, for me, this spoke to a couple of things, Pete. It's like, it tells me that we're fatigued by being in a crisis, and in the sense that people want to go back to how it was. They want to pull up the shutters from the rest of the world at the moment. Like, I'm just looking across the screen here. 71%, I want things to go back how they were. 71% says keep everybody out, don't care, just want to be safe here. There's this knowledge that you reference that people know that things are just not going to be normal until we roll out the vaccine, which is, you know, going a bit slow, more slowly here than other places. And then there's 43% or whatever the metric is, that's I don't think I could get through another lockdown. Now, I mean, that metric is not 80%, it's only 40%, but it just demonstrates to me that we're sort of at a fatigue point with the whole thing. We really wish that there was something that would come along and turn the tide, but we know that's not a quick fix. And getting back to Pete's point, which is that this is a very complex set of arrangements for the government to manage politically, that's exactly right. So because we're sort of dealing with a few moving parts here. We're dealing with the psychology of a community entering the second year of a pandemic and an economic downturn. So we're in year 2 now, not year 1, we're in year 2. And we're likely to be in this at least for another 12 months, probably longer, realistically, before things really start to shift. That's quite a long haul. So you got that. And then there's also the politics, which I just want to mention briefly. Last year, the sort of broad politics of COVID was a lot of Labor federally trying not to create many points of friction with the government in relation to the crisis. Anthony Albanese's view was that people didn't need it. People were genuinely in a crisis. They were concerned about their lives and livelihoods. They did not need constant carping at the federal level about the response to the crisis. They just needed a sense of safety that somehow institutions could pull together and get the country through. Now, I just think the statute of limitations on that has ended. I think if we look into the new political year, we see Labor starting to punch up on a number of fronts without just going completely crazy. But that's also a different political environment for Scott Morrison to navigate than the one he navigated in 2020.
And I do think that is a particularly potent way in for Labor, because it's not criticising performance. And I think the problem with criticising performance right through this has been people are prepared to give governments at all levels a leave pass for a mistake in an unprecedented crisis. So if you just go, no, you made a mistake there, it doesn't really get you far. But to say you are accountable for the borders, you guys always like to, you know, as you said, you're the border guys. Where are you with borders now? I think that is actually a way through here with 71% support.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's that sort of you've said it much more sharply than me. It's that accountability dynamic, that normal accountability dynamic. I think we'll see more of in politics this year than we saw last year.
I asked Kit to just make a comment on camera. Hi, Kit, just because he did raise it. The lockdown issue, surprised it was as low as 43%. Remember, this is a national poll, and I suspect, and John might help me here, that I think our friends in Victoria would have a much lower tolerance for another lockdown. But are you in Melbourne, Kit, and how are you going, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I am in Melbourne. Yeah, I was surprised because I couldn't imagine I couldn't imagine saying anything else, but I couldn't stand it. I was surprised that it wasn't higher. I was surprised about that when I was reading it today. Yeah. But that might be a Melbourne thing.
Yeah, what were the breakdowns, John?
Yeah, so Melbourne does have the highest agreement with that across the state. So that's just around 50%, Kate, so 51%. Following that, New South Wales, we've also recently had a few more restrictions at 46%. And a lot lower, what have we got? 38% in Queensland, 35% SA, 36% WA.
Yeah. Although, you know, anything that half the population says they just can't stand, that's, you know, it's no small thing.
No, it's not a small thing, but it's sort of also interesting too that how the high degree of public support for the lockdowns, like that has been consistent in the polling all the way through this this pandemic, like really high levels of support, and also in other surveys as well. Fundamentally, people realise that this has been a means to an end, but it is also incredibly fatiguing for people, and that's that has sort of led to this. Led to the number in this fortnight's survey.
I wonder also, John, whether the numbers supporting full border closure are higher in Victoria. And interesting, in a one-person focus group with you, Kit, and anyone else from Melbourne, like, do you think there is a bigger view that let's just lock the fuckers down, like we can't keep doing this? Like, do you think there is more tolerance there? And chime in, Liz, if you wanted to. You both got control of your mics, I believe. So, yeah.
Oh, look, it feels a bit unfair to have two bites at this cherry, but being a Victorian and, you know, a spin doctor of some, you know, long time, watching the kind of comms management around this for Victorians. And I feel like it's fascinating to see that our Premier is still way above water on his approval rating and, you know, 2PP, right? Because he has had the full court press of the Murdoch press and others, like, against him. Absolutely savage and fierce for 120 days of attack. And so just to add to Catherine saying, you know, voters have rediscovered their state government. The other thing that's happened in Victoria, I'd be interested in Kit's view or any other Victorian, is a lot of Victorians have, during that 120 days, you know, gone in live to the press conferences. So we've seen a form of political communication we haven't seen before. And as somebody who trained a whole lot of people in the 30-second grab, I think we are so beyond the 30-second grab as communications management now. So we've got to see our Premier and the questioning. So that, from a comms point of view and a political comms point of view, I'm interested in that. And yeah, no one wants to be in lockdown, but do we, you know, for me, it's kind of like, I think the community still is it Labor versus Liberal, state versus Fed? No, it's us versus the virus. And could you just get it right, please? Sorry, Pete.
Sorry, open question, anyone jump up. There is closing borders, which we officially do now, and there is also saying to Australians in the queue, sorry, you're going to have to wait a bit longer. Like, at what point is 12 months after this virus become the point at which there will, and I'm not going to say it's nativist, I think because it's actually against Australians in a public health, it's not your classic Hansonite them, it's actually us. But this is really interesting politics, I reckon, and yeah. I just don't quite know where it lands.
Question for Catherine. It feels to me like our federal government has skated through on all the issues that they could have been held responsible for in the pandemic. So the aged care disaster that unfolded down here, the border controls and quarantine. It's kind of like they've got this hands off. All they've done is chucked rocks at our government. But so I'm interested in what you think about that, how they've managed to do that. And the vaccine to me is the one thing where they've got one job. They better deliver it. Yes. What's your view about that?
Well, a couple of things. I think the politics of vaccination are just going to dominate the year. Like, I think that is the big story of the year. Does that, is it a screw up? Do the therapies work? Do the therapies turn the tide? Who gets blamed in the event that doesn't happen? I think that is absolutely, you know, you make the point, Liz, about how these guys have they have a very aerodynamic quality, this government. They do manage to put themselves above the fray in you know, quite frustrating ways from my vantage point. But they do have that quality of being able to levitate above it. But you can't, ultimately you can't outrun your own record. Everybody knows that the Commonwealth is predominantly responsible for the vaccination program. If there's a serious disaster, I think they will sheep the blame home to that jurisdiction. I genuinely do, because this is something that people are relying on to turn the tide in this thing. So I think the government privately is very nervous about how this is going to play out, which is why you see a whole lot of overcompensating behaviour, like sending the cameras down to see the planned land when Pfizer arrives, and Greg Hunt, declaring the eagle has landed. It's sort of like this kind of classic overcompensation, right? It's so engineered, like the vaccine's here, which is sort of like part politics. And I'll forgive them slightly because the Commonwealth does have, what's the word I'm looking for? It is desirable that the Commonwealth try and build community confidence. Like that is very important for a number of different reasons.
It's also raising the political stakes. And I guess if it is, if the eagle does land, it's a pretty smooth run you can see up into a federal ballot. But it also creates a real test of accountability.
Well, it's also, like how many times in the event, like no one wants this. Just to be clear, I do not want the vaccination program to fail. I like every other Australian, want the vaccination program to work.
The program.
Right? I absolutely want this to work. But in the event that this goes south, can you imagine how many times that Greg Hunt clip of the eagle has landed will be played on high rotation? It's sort of like, in a way, you are setting expectations like up there, and if you don't deliver them, then there's sucks to be you. So let's see how that goes. Look, the short answer to Liz's sort of question, I think, is that there's more genuinely in the federal space this year, and tougher stuff. Like what the feds have had to do predominantly over the last 12 months is hand out fiscal support, which was a genuinely difficult, set of propositions for this government. Could have been, but wasn't, because Morrison just said, hand out the money. And so they handed out the money. But this year, a number of things are happening simultaneously. They're taking back the money, never very popular to take back the money that you've handed people. The vaccination program is their bailiwick. Everybody knows it. If as Pete says, that the states can find common cause about shifting quarantine and borders more substantially back into Morrison's court, that's another point of pressure. So, I don't know what punctures the sort of collective community sense that these guys have been competent. Well, I guess incompetence punctures that. So if you demonstrate it, well, people will notice, I think.
One last question on that. In a way, the government's core competence has been announcements. They're really, really good at announcements. What do you think the matrix of accountability will be? Is it speed of rollout? Is it effective of it feels to me that effectiveness of a vaccine is kind of outside the government's control.
Well,
So we say they need to do it, but what is the it? And who's going to hold them to account on what grounds?
Well, in terms of who's going to hold them to account, I think point I made a minute ago is I think Labor federally will hold them to account this year. I think that's already in evidence, that dynamic. As long as I keep turning up to do this insane job, I'll hold them to account, and so will many of my colleagues. In terms of like the it, what is the it? It's a really good question, because as you say, can people legitimately blame the government if the therapies aren't effective? Well, probably not. Obviously, as what did Morrison say? Don't hold a hose. He doesn't kind of put on a lab coat and sort of.
Craig Kelly's not my doctor.
Not injecting anyone, people. Let's not do that. Anyway, sorry to make light of this. We've just got to laugh because it is the second year of a crisis, and periodically got to laugh. So obviously he's not doing that. I don't think people will blame him if these therapies can't keep up with the trajectory of the virus or whatever else. But delivery, whether sufficient numbers of doses arrive here expeditiously, don't get, just track back for 1 sec. Remember last year at the beginning of the crisis, there was all of this, there was a shortage of PPE, right, everywhere. And shipments were being sort of intercepted. Weird stuff was happening, right? All kinds of, PPE nationalism, vaccine nationalism is the new version of this. So even though the Commonwealth has got contracts and we have our own manufacturing facility, CSL, who can manufacture a vaccine locally. Supply is difficult. Like maybe it's okay, maybe it isn't. It's too soon to say, right? And so if the doses don't arrive, I think we'll hear a lot of noise around that. If they can't be rolled out effectively, more noise around that. There was an epidemiologist who, I've just forgotten her name, she's terrific. She advises the WHO. She told the press club last week that at the peak of this thing, we're going to need 190,000 vaccinations a day in order to roll this thing out. I mean, just wrap your head around that. 190,000 vaccinations a day. It's a lot. Can our systems, doctors' surgeries, pharmacies, other kind of infrastructure the government's enacting to try and get this done quickly, can we do it at the speed that it needs to be done at? Again, maybe, open question at this point. If it can't be done, then again, I think we'll hear some static around that. So, look, we can't answer all of the questions now because events are yet
I just think it's interesting if this is the test. If this is the test of the government, what are the matrices? And I think, and then, not to even contemplate more mutations, chasing, different versions with, evolving vaccines. So there's still lots of moving parts here. And I guess my point of reflection is, I started the year thinking, okay, that was the pandemic. Let's get back to climate change. I've been really into digital rights reform, as you know. There's IR reform. It's kind of, we're quite not, when, we can walk and chew gum, but gee, the walking's important at the moment.
Yeah, the walking is very important. And it is useful too, with those things you mentioned. It's useful to put that in front of people because this whole revolution in digital rights is playing out in my neck of the woods this week. That's really important, really fundamental. It's playing out as we speak. The whole IR stuff is also playing out. The government's got quite a lot on its plate. And so far, all the balls are in the air. Just whether or not they can keep them all in the air. Let's see.
Well, I'm going to get John to jump back into a couple more slides just to sort of keep the conversation moving along. We did ask about Craig Kelly. And we kind of did some comments, not so much about whether Craig Kelly is what the majority of the people probably think he is, but what it means. 57% support the proposition that he's undermining Scott Morrison's leadership. 56 say that, he's playing a sideshow. And, I think particularly some of that really excellent analysis of his social media from Casey Briggs at the ABC really reinforced he's really playing to an offshore audience rather than a local audience. Less support for this being a test of Morrison. I think it's more Kelly undermining Morrison. So I don't know how it plays in the bigger picture, but it's definitely a diversion when you're trying to get an important public health message out, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. But it's also why it's absolutely a diversion, and obviously a member of the government shouldn't be promulgating unproven therapies. It just shouldn't be happening in the middle of a pandemic where people's lives and livelihoods are on the line. It's not a game. It's not a seminar. You shouldn't take liberties in a crisis, and liberties are being taken. In terms of, though, it's slightly complex for the government because it's interesting. Obviously, people think Kelly's sort of freelancing is undermining Morrison, but one of the sort of underreported dynamics in politics has been the sort of effective at this stage anyway, despite sort of nativist sentiment being heightened as we've got in these Fortress Australia metrics this fortnight. Pauline Hanson's vote seems to have collapsed or semi-collapsed, right? That vote, that Australian vote is sort of has gone back to the major parties, at least in the most recent electoral contest, which is Queensland, which is a place where one nation is normally strong. So in a way, Scott Morrison's been very reluctant to rebuke Kelly. That only happened during the last parliamentary sitting week because things were pushed to a point where it just was unsustainable because Kelly had leapt across the fence from promulgating on unproven therapies to starting to articulate vaccine hesitancy, which is obviously really bad at a time where you're trying to roll out a vaccination. So Morrison had to intervene. He did it in the lightest touch possible, because my own view about that is that the coalition is wanting to signal to Hanson voters that that the coalition is a place where 1,000 flowers bloom, where if you've got a theory about unproven COVID therapies, the culture of the coalition allows one to articulate these things. It's sort of like you're signalling. You're saying to disaffected voters who you might lose to Hanson, or the many now competitors to Hanson, you are safe to vote for us. Look at these guys. They do this stuff all the time. They're within our tent. So that's a sort of interesting micro element of the Australian political scene at the moment, which is how, well, both the major parties in different ways are, I suppose, trying to appeal to voters who, in a different set of conditions, may vote for a protest party other than the major parties.
Yeah. I'll just call Denise up, because Denise Shrevell, who's just made the point in the chat that there is a bit of a groundswell to come up with an alternative to Kelly in Hughes. And Denise is going to be hosting a monthly Zoom with her crew of Ozpol citizens, online citizens, during the course of the year. But Denise, what's going on in Hughes? Oh, she might not have taken it. I did offer. We'll find out next time she jumps up. Anyway, let's move on to the last couple then. Sorry, Denise. COVID and employee concerns. We've been picking this up in a bit of our research. Job security is kind of the number one issue by a fair way there. I think you'll see a lot of IR being framed around that, as opposed to pay for the next little period. And, you know, and then we've got some things on emission targets here. This is kind of interesting too, Catherine. Oh, yeah. Lost it there, John. No, it's there.
No, it's there. Yeah, it's semi all over the place, really, these answers, aren't they, Pete? Like, it's sort of, it's interesting. And we think we're obviously more attentive to doing stuff by 2030, which is good. That's really good if we are, because that aligns with the science. That aligns with what the science tells us we need to do. Less sort of more focused on that in terms of the answer to this question, in terms of more focused on that than 2050. And obviously,
then we gave them a binary choice. I'm not sure, you know, I think there is a groundswell for action. 9% do nothing, 32% kick it down the road, and 58% go now. Like 60% still seems to be the sweet spot on carbon action. It's just that we can't get a consensus on either side of politics to make that happen.
Yep. Don't trigger me.
I know. One more, I think we've got, and then we'll sort of give everyone an early mark. What's this? Exclusion of regional industries from emission targets. That was a big call from our friends in the National Party.
Yeah.
Strongly support, somewhat support. What do we get? Oh, 32 to... So when you frame it up like that, it's obviously quite popular.
Yeah, but it's sort of, again, it's sort of like, I understand why we're obliged to ask this question, because this was kicked around. But it's sort of like, I can't quite believe that, you know, I would have thought we've jumped so many sharks in the kind of climate debate that there was no sharks left to jump until the Nats started raving on about getting an exemption to a non-existent mechanism. It was kind of like, what? Like, at least in the olden times.
But wasn't Canavan also calling to quarantine coal?
Yeah. It's like, you know, here's the Nats plan to reduce emissions. Let's exempt all the emitters. Like, there it is. There's your bold plan for emissions reduction. Impose no penalties on anyone who emits anything. But it's sort of, it's kind of like a step back from that. That's so weird, because we've, like, I don't know, I'm so bruised by this debate. I'm semi-coherent, but it's kind of like, you know, we've had the carbon pricing discussion. We've had, well, we had John Howard's ETS, then we had Labor's carbon CPRS, then we had the clean energy scheme, then we had the National Energy Guarantee, which was preceded briefly by the energy target. You know, it's like we've, but at least in all of the absurdity, and this has been just rolling absurdity for quite a long time, We've been talking about actual mechanisms. We've now got to a point in the climate debate where the Nats are saying, we must not do this brackets thing that doesn't exist. I mean, Morrison has proposed no mechanism to reduce emissions. None, doesn't exist. So anyway, it's just very curious for someone like me who's obviously been to too many rodeos and has sustained a brain injury or something.
Let's finish off. Is there anything positive to throw on the table before we go? What's the positive view of what happens this week?
Okay, what's the positive view? Well, I think genuinely, if in my neck of the woods, forgive the self-interest and with obvious declarations that my own organisation, Guardian Australia, is in the middle of negotiations with Google about their showcase, negotiations that I have no insight into because obviously I work in church and others work in state. So I don't know what's happening really, but I know that's happening and broadly, and I know that this architecture is making its way to the Parliament. If all of that lands, that is genuinely transformative for my industry. So that would be a happy thing to happen. And I'm not saying that from a purely self-interested perspective. I genuinely believe that it would be helpful to democracy if we had more diverse media outlets with some prospect of being able to survive. So I'll be pretty happy if that happens. Also,
I might also say, just before you round out that thought, it's a first step in digital platform reform. There are privacy reforms,
exactly.
There's disinformation reforms to Craig Kelly, and there's important ad tech reforms that are still making their way through the Parliament. I think the big tragedy will be if the politicians focus their mind with the support of the media just on the bargaining code and don't do the rest of it, because it's kind of the easy step to do something everyone agrees with inside the bubble.
Harder than it looks. But yes, I agree that that in terms of the other propositions that we're talking about, which relate to surveillance capitalism, it's like that they're much tougher things to try and negotiate into some sort of legislative response. So I totally agree with that. And I'm also cheered, even though these are horrible stories, that women who have had really dreadful things happen to them in politics keep speaking up. I just think I'm glad women are finding their voices around that stuff. I remain ever hopeful that somebody might listen, and by listen I mean do something substantive.
Terrific. And final ad, Friday, if you're around, Guardian Australia Book Club, which is on the topic of raising girls in a challenging world. Lucy Clark will host a discussion with Casey Edwards, Christopher Scanlon, and Madonna King. So that looks pretty interesting for those that want to change the pace a little bit. Hey, thanks for being part of it today, Catherine. Thanks for jumping on, Liz and Kit and John, and good luck for the rest of the day, everyone, and stay safe for those in Melbourne. Cheers, guys.